Are there good arguments against God? Well, considering there are absolutely no good arguments for God, what difference does that make? But the religious love to run around with the goalposts, and today we're going to oblige them, even though it's not going to help them out one bit. So here we go on another mission into the depths of religious stupidity, and don't say I didn't warn you. I haven't taken a look at Bishop Robert Barron for a while, and back when I was looking at apologists, a couple of people said they'd be interested, so here you go. I honestly don't think he's particularly worthwhile, although I don't really think that any apologist is particularly worthwhile, so I'm not sure what that really says. The problem is, if we're going to be honest about it, that their job is to con dumb people. I mean, that's what they do for a living. And I don't find that at all impressive. But maybe this video is going to change my mind. I don't know. So let's look at 3 arguments against God and why I don't figure he's really going to say anything of value.
I think the very best arguments against the existence of God have been formulated by believers. Now, here's what I mean.
Well, before you get going, I'm going to step in and explain why I don't think that's right, or at the very least, why it doesn't work out that way in the real world. See, believers, even if they come up with good reasons to question the existence of God, they're not going to actually pay any attention to those reasons, because they don't really care, if you're going to be honest, and I always am, whether their gods actually exist. It's just there for fifis and faith, not for anything real. In fact, they're much more likely, at least in my experience, to invent reasons to ignore those attacks on their faith because they don't actually care if what they believe is true, as I said. Even if they did come up with any of these things, the fact that they remain religious thereafter says an awful lot about their interest in coming to realistic conclusions because, as we all know, they don't actually care. They just want to believe.
The story of Job is one of the great arguments against God's existence because of the awful suffering that Job, a righteous man, he's a good righteous man, follower of the Lord, and yet he goes through every type of suffering.
No, that's just an argument against the kind of God that you want to believe in. It says nothing at all about an evil God. But I also have to ask some serious questions here. Job, scholars generally agree, was written sometime between the 7th and 4th century BCE. It's also possible that it's even older than Genesis, which clocks in somewhere between the 6th and 5th centuries. So how are Christians involved in this one at all, since Christianity wouldn't even exist until half a millennium later? This is where we have to recognize that God, at least the God described in the Bible, is a complete dick. But the Christians sure don't follow through on that, do they? Because they come up with a way to baldly rationalize their way around the passages that say things they don't like. So this really isn't that impressive.
And it leads Job to question at least the goodness of God, if not the existence of God. Go forward many centuries to Thomas Aquinas. When Thomas sets up the question, does God exist, he first lays out objections.
Not really. All that happens is that he addresses questions likely that existed at the same time that he was writing, and then he makes excuses for why those questions aren't valid when it comes to his God. He really wanted to believe, just like Barron here does. That's the whole point. You look at objections that people have, and then you find a way to explain your way around them. That's exactly what happens today. For every objection that we can raise, apologists will just make things up out of whole cloth or rely on faith and blind belief for why those objections aren't good enough to make them give up the faith. because they don't want to give up the faith. They just want to be happy, and happiness really isn't a good reason to believe anything. This is why I'm not at all impressed by people like Robert Barron. I don't care what you want. I want $1 trillion in the bank, but I'm not stupid enough to think that it's actually there. And you shouldn't be impressed by any of this crap either.
If one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. So if there were an infinite heat, there'd be nothing cold. But God is described as infinitely good. Therefore, if God exists, there wouldn't be any evil.
And that would make sense, but now he'll find a way to explain his way around it because he has to get back to his interpretation of the divine. See, a rational person, realizing that there was a contradiction, would simply adjust their views of God, or better yet, reject the standard Christian view of God in favor of something that has less contradictions. They wouldn't just invent things out of whole cloth to explain why their emotionally comforting beliefs just have to be true because, fifis. But I'm sure that's exactly what he's going to do. Let's watch.
But there is evil. Therefore, God doesn't exist.
That's not exactly the case. The God that is all good can't exist. That doesn't mean that some other kind of God might not. Even within Christianity, there are believers who don't think God is all good. They tend to be rejected out of hand by the others, but they still exist. But let's look at why he's saying this. He knows that the people that he's trying to reach, the ones most likely to watch this video, at least he's hoping, they're people who are going to gasp in horror at the suggestion and look to him to explain why God must actually exist, the God that he's describing. If only there were an ad hoc explanation offered for it, and that's what he's going to do. At least that's what I figure, because that's what all of these apologists do. They start with the conclusion that they want to reach, and then they make up reasons why they actually reach it. But that's not how reality works, is it?
That's a darn good argument. Dostoevsky was a deeply believing Christian, and yet he puts on the lips of his character Ivan Karamazov this awful argument against God. And Ivan is trying to convince his brother Alyosha, who had been a monk and was a devoutly mystical religious person. And he says, look at all these examples of innocent children being tortured, in some cases tortured to death. I mean, read that, and it's as convincing as anything.
Yet, you're still there in your clerical collar. Something is clearly overriding the evidence against your beliefs, and that thing, let's be honest, is your feelings. You want it to be true, therefore it doesn't really matter how ludicrous your beliefs actually are, how ridiculously flawed they clearly look to anybody on the outside. You're not going to believe it because that would hurt your feelings, and you can't have that. That's where all of this comes from. It's not about taking the best available data and following it to the most rational conclusion that you can find. It's all about feeling good. And that's just childish.
So three believers, the author of Job, Thomas Aquinas, and Dostoevsky, all lay out this argument, which is if there's so much evil in the world, let's face it, there can't be an all-good God. These are very good arguments against God.
Yet, you're still a Christian, aren't you? This is why having rational discussions with these people is so difficult, because they're not interested in being rational. They just want to believe. They're certainly not alone in that. Lots and lots of crazy people believe lots and lots of crazy things for entirely emotional reasons, but that's not a good thing when you think about it. People think aliens have to be there too, mutilating cows and having their way with abductee assholes because they just really don't want to be alone in the universe. But that doesn't mean that you're not alone in the universe. It doesn't mean that you are, but it doesn't mean that you're not. What you want doesn't matter, does it? Only what is actually real does. So please, just get on with your ad hoc rationalizations. It's not going to make you look any better, but I guess at least we can all get a good laugh.
They're the best that the atheists have, is the argument from evil.
Whoa, 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 hold up a minute. You started this whole thing off saying that Christians came up with the best arguments. You gave 3 examples of Christians presenting these arguments, and now you want to pretend that these are the best arguments that atheists have too? Are we watching the same video? Atheists don't have to have any arguments against God, any more than I have to have arguments against Bigfoot. The failure is entirely on the side making the claim. You haven't presented any evidence. That's your fuck up, not ours. Maybe you need to get back to work actually proving that your imaginary friend is real, because it's not our job to prove you wrong, it's your job to prove yourself right. If you can't, we're just not going to take your absurd claims seriously. Jeez, this guy is a real idiot, isn't he? Anyway, as I've said before, the argument from evil isn't an argument against God. It's an argument against the arbitrary religious characteristics that have been just stapled onto your undemonstrable magical friend in the sky. The things that you say about your God make absolutely no sense, and they don't match up with what we see in reality. You can't demonstrate that your God even exists, much less has these specific characteristics. It's because you made the whole thing up, but you don't want to admit it. But anyway, go right ahead, get on to your straw man, because it's really all that you've got.
Thomas Aquinas says, God is so good that he permits certain evils so as to bring about a greater good that could never have been accomplished otherwise.
See? What did I tell you? Now, I have to ask, how in the hell did Thomas Aquinas know any of that at all? He just yanked those rationalizations right out of his butthole, just like every other apologist ever has. That's all any of these people are doing, after all. It's why we have to ask those questions. How do you know that? Not why do you believe it, not why do you want it to be true, not why do you have faith in it. How did you come to that bit of knowledge objectively, and how have you put it to the test to see if it stood up to skeptical rigor? Because they didn't do any of that at all, did they? This is just childish fifis on display. They don't actually care if any of it is true, it just gets them to the emotionally comforting place that they want to be in, so they don't actually give a damn what path they have to take in order to get there. We're up to the point in the program where he's just going to make a bunch of stuff up, or quote other people who just made a bunch of stuff up, and that's not going to be remotely impressive. So, let's get back to it, Bob. You're just making a fool of yourself, as always.
There are examples where we can see that happening, that because of this evil, something really good happened to me that wouldn't have happened otherwise. That job I didn't get that was so devastating to me and caused so much suffering. But because I didn't get that job, I got this other job, which in fact has proved to be so life-giving.
And the rationalizations roll on and on and on and on. Because that's all any of this is. It's a way to deal with disappointments by pretending that there must have been a purpose behind it all. Yet that only works if you cherry-pick the examples. What about the people who die? You know, the people who get cancer or some other terrible disease, and they die in agony. What's the silver lining in that? Because those are the people that they don't want to talk about. They want to think it's all part of God's plan. Cool. What was the plan when my father died of cancer? What was the good that came out of that? Want to explain that one to us, Bobby? Or is this going to be more of that God works in mysterious ways bullshit? Because whether you like it or not, that's just another rationalization.
That relationship that meant so much to me, that breakup just broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. But because of that, I met this woman to whom I'm now married, and I found the joy of my life.
And of course, the rationalizations just keep going. What would have happened if you hadn't met anyone? What if you'd spent the rest of your life regretting your decision? Well, of course, he wouldn't have brought it up in that case because that would get in the way of his story. This is all just confirmation bias. Count the hits and ignore the misses. And this is the dishonesty of religion, even if he's not consciously trying to be dishonest. And we don't really know if he is or not, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He wants to get to a specific conclusion. Therefore, he selects things from his pool of possibilities that just proves his point, while ignoring all the possibilities that don't. We can easily find plenty of cases if we just stick with the instances of people breaking up with girlfriends or boyfriends where things just don't work out so well. What about the guy who, devastated that he lost the supposed love of his life, goes out and jumps off a bridge and drowns? Is that a better alternative? Well, of course not. But people like Barron would never bring that one up because it doesn't help their case. This is all just emotional pablum offered up to the religiously gullible. And that's pretty pathetic.
Aquinas extrapolates from those experiences to say, well, that's the way to think about God's permission of suffering.
Well, sure, because Aquinas had the same emotional attachment to the beliefs that you do. Never mind that there's no good reason to think that there are any gods in the first place. He had a goal in mind, and he was desperately looking for a way to justify it, just like you do. That doesn't make any of it true, though, does it? We keep running into the same kind of bad logic and irrational reason from the religious because they're not actually concerned about reality. They don't care if any of this is really true. They just want to be happy, and as I keep saying, that's utterly childish.
I think a lot of people are tripped up by a misunderstanding of what we mean by God. If you imagine God as one more big contingent thing among others, well then there's no evidence for that reality.
No, there is no evidence for your imaginary friend, period. At least you haven't presented any that would convince a skeptic. Because I don't care what you mean when you talk about God. I care what you can objectively demonstrate is actually real in the real world. I don't care what claims that you make about God. I care what you can back up with demonstrable objective evidence. I also don't care if somebody makes claims about Zeus or Odin. They have the same level of responsibility. They have to back up what they claim too. Ultimately, nobody cares what you say about God because you can say anything about anything. That doesn't make any of it real, and reality is all that matters. Maybe you people ought to give that a shot. It can only help.
But what's extraordinary is when you look at the surveys of a lot of young people who are disaffiliating, it's amazing how many say some version of, well, I don't believe in this old man in the sky anymore. Well, I would have hoped you let that go when you let go of Santa Claus. I mean, it's the same kind of thing.
So close. So close. Because God is the same kind of thing as Santa Claus. It's an unjustified claim made by people with a stunted intellectual and rational development, believed in on faith because they really wish it was true. At least that's the way it is for the kids, because the parents hopefully know better. In fact, that is a pretty good analogy because the parents in this case are really the clergy. You know, the people who should know better, probably don't, but they should know better. They know they're just telling a fanciful story to the dumb people in the pews, the kids in this example, to make them happy. So, yeah, that's actually a pretty good analogy when you think about it. We're not the ones coming up with this old man in the sky garbage. That's you. Look at any depiction of God, and that's what they all look like. So don't pull a straw man and say, well, that's not what God is like. Because I bet the overwhelming majority of Christians would disagree with you, including the overwhelming majority of Catholics, because that is the classical depiction of God. Just because you don't like the fact that so many people are walking away from your delusions, that doesn't mean you get to alter reality.
And the fact that so many young people have been co-opted by these really inadequate understandings of God, of faith, of the Bible, of suffering, of all that. He's a reason, I'll put it more philosophically, why there's something rather than nothing.
Really? Prove it! Because this is one of the places that every religion, at least the ones we commonly hear from, goes so horribly wrong. Even if there was a reason needed for something rather than nothing, and that's just a piss-poor understanding of science right there, but even if we needed an explanation, you have no evidence whatsoever that your God done it. Nobody does. Just because you want it to be true, that doesn't make it true. And all the faith and wishful thinking in the world doesn't change that. It's just an empty claim. If you people want to be taken seriously, you have to be able to back it up in some kind of demonstrable way. And I'd recommend you got to work on that, because until you do, you're just being morons.
Why there is a contingent, finite world at all.
Again, prove it. Because just making these ludicrous empty claims about your made-up deity, that doesn't actually impress anybody with a brain. This is why appeals to faith are so useless. What makes it your God and not the Hindu ones, or the Norse ones, or the gods of an alien species that we don't even know about yet? How do you demonstrably get there? And the answer is, of course, that they don't. Then, when people just walk away from your ridiculous faith, they try to shift the goalposts and pretend it's not really their fault that they fail, it's gotta be somebody else. Sorry, but you're just wrong. It is you. You can't support your idiotic beliefs. And until you can, nobody in their right mind is going to take you seriously. That's why in the US right now, the number of Catholic churches declined by 11% between 2000 and 2019, which is the last year we have data for at the moment, and the number of Catholics dropped by 2 million people. The number of Catholic baptisms declined by 34%. You people are going out of business. It's only a matter of time.
So I think that's the fundamental mistake that a lot of atheists, both old and new, tend to make. They don't understand what serious believers mean by the word God.
Are we going to play the no true Christian fallacy here? Anybody who doesn't believe exactly like you do, the exact same delusions that you do, well, they're not serious believers. Do you understand just how stupid that sounds? Probably not, because most theists are completely blinded to their own shortcomings. Not like they care or anything. We've watched Robert Barron make a complete fool of himself on numerous occasions, and that's hardly going to come as a surprise to anybody with a brain. These people are completely incompetent. And maybe they ought to knock that off. Not that, as we all know, not that they care.
That's, to a degree, our fault. We've been lousy at teaching and catechesis and preaching. Catholicism is a deeply intelligent tradition. But why do we hide those treasures away from young people? Young people are saying the stupidest things about their own religion. Well, I mean, that's to a large degree our fault.
Well, it's your fault for believing something so stupid in the first place. Because young people, that's most people these days, but he wants to focus on the young, they're starting to realize just how idiotic Christianity and other religions actually are. Just because you're not bright enough to figure it out doesn't mean that other people aren't. And it's kind of sad that a 12-year-old is a hell of a lot smarter than Bishop Robert Barron, but that seems to be the case, doesn't it? Sad, but honestly, it's really not at all surprising.
So there is a crisis in preaching, teaching, and catechesis, and we got to take some responsibility for that.
Oh, like your church has taken responsibility for child sex abuse, right? Because newsflash for you, Padre, it's still going on. You people have been hemorrhaging money for decades, and it's only getting worse. And funny, you don't seem to care about that very much, do you? Oh, you do your best to hide your money from the victims, but you don't even seriously talk about the celibacy problem in the priesthood or closer oversight by people from outside the church. The clergy is still telling victims not to go to the police, and in June 2021, a team of UN special investigators who report to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, they criticized the Vatican and other Catholic entities that they have consistently obstructed investigations and failed to cooperate with domestic judicial proceedings in order to prevent accountability for abusers and compensation for victims. That was just a year ago. How long have you idiots been saying that you have to do a better job? A better job at what? Hiding it? Because that seems to be all the Catholic Church is good at, and they're hardly alone. Most major denominations out there are under some kind of investigation for sex abuse of minors. They're all doing the same damn thing that the Catholic Church is, pointing fingers at everybody else and trying to avoid being responsible for their own crimes. Because nobody wants to change their ways. That's exactly why so many people are walking away from religion. Reality has shifted away from religion, and religion hasn't changed itself to keep pace. I don't really think it's possible at this point because it's like people who are trying to maintain a belief in Santa Claus, since he brought that up earlier, because there is no Santa Claus. I don't care how many sermons you offer on the subject, anybody over the age of 10 who still believes, and those numbers are falling every single day, there's something really wrong with those people. Then you get bozos like Robert Barron here, who are trying to scam the gullible and remain employed, because that's what religion ultimately is anymore. It's really all it ever was. It's a con job, and they're rapidly running out of people to con. Either they need to find a way to prove that their beliefs are true, and that's prove with evidence, not just, it makes me feel good to say so, or they're going to go out of business. And it couldn't happen to a more deserving group of criminals. So, adios, Bobby boy. Don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. And hopefully, you don't end up behind bars like a lot of your Catholic brethren.
Bum